4:30 on the morning of the 12th of April 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire across Charleston Harbor. Their target was Fort Sumter, a federal installation still occupied by United States soldiers, even though South Carolina had already declared that it had left the Union. Inside the fort, Major Robert Anderson and fewer than 100 men faced an impossible position. Their food and supplies were running low, Confederate batteries surrounded the harbor, and Washington had announced that provisions were being sent. The confrontation could no longer remain a political argument conducted through letters and speeches. For roughly 34 hours, shells crossed the harbor. Fires broke out inside the fort, ammunition became increasingly difficult to use, and Anderson eventually agreed to evacuate. Remarkably, the bombardment itself caused no combat deaths. Yet politically, the consequences were enormous. Fort Sumter transformed a constitutional crisis into open warfare. After the attack, President Abraham Lincoln called for troops to suppress the rebellion. More Southern states then joined the Confederacy. Within weeks, a confrontation that politicians had spent months trying to contain had become a national war. But the cannons at Fort Sumter did not create the conflict they unleashed. They did not create slavery, sectional rivalry, territorial disputes, collapsing political parties, or decades of failed compromises. The guns were new. The conflict behind them was not. To understand why Americans were finally willing to fire on other Americans, we have to leave Charleston Harbor behind and rewind the story much further. Because long before Fort Sumter became a battlefield, the United States had already built a political system around a question it could never permanently settle. To understand the road to civil war, we have to go back before 1861, before the Republican Party, and before most of the political crises Americans remember from school. The conflict was rooted in a contradiction that had existed inside the Republic from its earliest years. The United States was founded on language about liberty, natural rights, and representative government. Yet slavery remained legal across much of the country. Millions of people were held as property, forced to labor without freedom, wages, or political rights, inside a nation that increasingly described itself as a model of human liberty. Over time, that contradiction developed differently across regions. Northern states gradually restricted or abolished slavery, while the plantation economy of the South became more deeply dependent on enslaved labor. The expansion of cotton made slavery not less important, but more valuable to Southern landowners and investors. And here is the critical thing. The most dangerous question was not simply whether slavery would continue where it already existed. The question was what would happen when the United States expanded westward and created new territories that would eventually become states. Every new state meant political power. It meant senators in Washington, representatives in Congress, and votes in presidential elections. If new states entered as free states, the political influence of slaveholding states could weaken. If slavery expanded westward, its political and economic power could grow with the nation. Now, imagine the problem from both sides. Many Northerners feared that allowing slavery to spread would give what they called the slave power greater control over the federal government. Southern slaveholders increasingly feared that restricting expansion would place their entire social and economic system on a path toward eventual destruction. That meant every new piece of Western land carried the same explosive question with it. Would it be free, or would it permit slavery? The United States could keep expanding its borders, but it could not keep avoiding that question forever. By 1820, the argument became serious enough to threaten the balance of the Union itself. Congress responded with a compromise, drew a line across the map, and convinced itself that the crisis had been contained. It had not. It had only been postponed. In 1820, the crisis centered on Missouri. The territory wanted to enter the Union as a slave state, and that immediately raised a dangerous political question. If Missouri joined the South, would slaveholding states gain lasting control in the Senate? Congress responded with what became known as the Missouri Compromise. Missouri entered as a slave state, while Maine entered as a free state, preserving the balance between the two sections. At the same time, Congress drew a geographic line across the Louisiana Purchase at latitude 36 degrees 30 minutes. North of that line, slavery would generally be prohibited in future territories. South of it, slavery could expand. On paper, the arrangement looked practical. It reduced the immediate crisis, protected the political balance, and gave both sections enough to claim that the Union had survived. But here is the critical thing. Congress had not solved the argument over slavery. It had drawn a boundary around it. The compromise treated the problem as if geography could contain a conflict that was moral, economic, constitutional, and increasingly political. For a time, the system appeared to work. The United States continued expanding. New states entered the Union, and national politicians learned to treat sectional balance almost like an equation. Add one free state here, one slave state there, and perhaps the machinery could keep running. But every compromise depended on one assumption: that future expansion would remain manageable. That assumption would not survive. The United States was about to acquire enormous new territories in the West, and every acre would reopen the question Congress thought it had settled. The Missouri Compromise did not remove the fuse, it simply pushed the flame farther down the line. And when war with Mexico transformed the map of North America, the old political formula would begin to break apart. By the 1840s, the United States was expanding with astonishing speed. The idea of manifest destiny encouraged many Americans to believe that the nation was meant to stretch across the continent. But expansion carried a political danger that Washington had never truly solved. That danger exploded after the Mexican-American War. When the fighting ended in 1848, the United States gained an enormous amount of territory in the West, including land that would become California, Nevada, Utah, and large parts of several other future states. On a map, this looked like a historic victory. Politically, it created a nightmare. Every new territory reopened the same question Congress had tried to contain in 1820. Would slavery be allowed to expand into the land taken from Mexico? This was not just a moral argument, it was a struggle over power. Every future state meant 2 senators, representatives in Congress, and influence over presidential elections. The balance between free states and slave states could determine which section controlled the federal government. Many northern politicians feared that slavery would spread across the West and strengthen Southern influence in Washington. Many Southern slaveholders feared the opposite. If slavery were blocked from new territories, they believed their political power would shrink as the nation continued growing around them. And here is where the old compromise system began to fail. The Missouri Compromise had worked by drawing a line across one specific territory, but the Mexican Cession added vast new lands where that old boundary offered no simple political answer. Attempts to settle the issue only revealed how divided the country had become. Proposals like the Wilmot Proviso tried to prohibit slavery in territory acquired from Mexico, while Southern politicians insisted that slaveholders had constitutional rights to take their property westward. The war with Mexico had expanded the United States, but it also expanded the conflict inside it. More land did not reduce sectional tension, it multiplied the number of places where that tension could erupt. By 1850, Washington was facing another national crisis. Once again, politicians reached for compromise. And once again, the agreement they created would calm the country on the surface, while making the deeper conflict even harder to contain. By 1850, the political crisis had become impossible to ignore. California wanted to enter the Union as a free state, threatening the delicate balance between free and slave states. At the same time, Congress still had to decide what would happen to slavery across the vast territories taken from Mexico. The result was the Compromise of 1850, a package of laws designed to keep the Union together. California entered as a free state. Utah and New Mexico would decide the slavery question through popular sovereignty. The slave trade was abolished in Washington, D.C., although slavery itself remained legal there. To many politicians, the compromise looked like another successful rescue. Neither section received everything it wanted, but both received enough to remain inside the Union. Once again, Washington had managed to push the immediate crisis away without confronting the deeper contradiction underneath it. But buried inside the agreement was one provision that would carry the conflict far beyond the plantations of the South. The new Fugitive Slave Act strengthened federal requirements for the capture and return of people who had escaped slavery, even when they reached free states in the North. That changed the political geography of slavery. A Northerner could no longer easily treat the institution as a distant Southern problem. Federal marshals could pursue fugitives through Northern communities, while citizens could be required to assist authorities in enforcing a law many of them considered morally unacceptable. Imagine living in Boston or another northern city where slavery had long been abolished. A person who had escaped bondage could be arrested nearby, placed under federal authority, and returned to slavery. Suddenly, the national government was enforcing the slave system directly in places where many residents believed it should not exist. The backlash was intense. Abolitionists organized resistance networks. Some state governments passed personal liberty laws intended to obstruct enforcement. Southern politicians, meanwhile, accused the North of refusing to honor constitutional obligations and demanded stronger protection for slaveholders whose enslaved workers had escaped. This is the hidden flaw in the Compromise of 1850. It reduced tension inside Congress by spreading the conflict into streets, courts, churches, newspapers, and local communities. Washington had not contained the argument. In a very real sense, it had nationalized it, and the peace did not last long. Just 4 years later, Congress would reopen the entire question of slavery in the West and destroy the geographic settlement that had helped hold the Union together since 1820. This time, the political argument would not remain inside Congress. It would spill into bloodshed. In 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a law that was supposed to organize new Western territories and clear the way for expansion. Instead, it destroyed one of the political arrangements that had helped hold the country together for more than 30 years. The act created the territories of Kansas and Nebraska and embraced the idea of popular sovereignty. Rather than having Congress decide whether slavery would be permitted, settlers living in each territory would vote on the question themselves. On the surface, that sounded democratic and practical, but there was a much bigger consequence. The Kansas-Nebraska Act effectively overturned the Missouri Compromise restriction that had limited slavery north of the 36-degree 30-minute line. A boundary that had contained the issue since 1820 was suddenly gone. For many Northerners, this looked like proof that slavery was not being contained at all. It was expanding politically. For many Southern slaveholders, the new law represented an opportunity to carry slavery into territories that had previously been closed to it. Then the struggle moved from Congress to Kansas itself. Pro-slavery settlers crossed into the territory, while anti-slavery settlers arrived from northern states. Both sides understood that whoever controlled the population, elections, and territorial government might determine the future legal status of slavery there. The political contest quickly turned violent. Rival governments claimed legitimacy. Elections were surrounded by accusations of intimidation and fraud. Armed groups attacked communities, destroyed property, and killed opponents. Newspapers across the country began calling the territory Bleeding Kansas. This was more than a local frontier conflict. Kansas became a preview of what happened when both sides stopped believing that ordinary political procedures could settle the slavery question. Ballots still existed, but increasingly, rifles stood behind them. Violence also reached Washington. In 1856, Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina brutally attacked Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts on the Senate floor. After Sumner delivered an anti-slavery speech, reactions to the assault divided sharply along sectional lines. In the North, Brooks was widely condemned. In parts of the South, he was celebrated. The disagreement was no longer only over policy. Americans were beginning to disagree over whether political violence itself could be justified in defense of their section. The Kansas-Nebraska Act also shattered the national party system. The Whig Party collapsed, unable to survive its internal divisions over slavery. Out of the wreckage, the Republican Party rose rapidly, united above all by opposition to the expansion of slavery into Western territories. That was a major turning point. For decades, national political parties had linked voters across North and South. Now, those bridges were breaking. The country was not merely arguing over slavery anymore. Its political system itself was beginning to split along sectional lines. For decades, America's political parties had done more than compete for votes. They had connected North and South inside the same national coalitions. Whigs and Democrats both contained politicians from different regions, forcing sectional interests to negotiate inside shared political organizations. But the slavery question was tearing those coalitions apart. The Whig Party could no longer hold together Northern members who opposed the expansion of slavery and Southern members who defended it. After the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that internal contradiction became almost impossible to manage. Out of the collapse came a new political force. The Republican Party grew rapidly across the North, bringing together former Whigs, anti-slavery Democrats, Free Soilers, and others who opposed the expansion of slavery into Western territories. The Republicans did not initially demand immediate abolition everywhere slavery already existed. Their central position was that slavery should not be allowed to expand into the territories. But to many Southern slaveholders, even that restriction represented a serious threat to their future political influence. And here is the deeper problem. National elections were becoming increasingly sectional. A political party could now become powerful without building substantial support across both North and South. The old electoral incentives that had encouraged compromise were beginning to disappear. America was no longer simply debating slavery inside a shared political system. It was building rival political blocs around the issue. And when the Supreme Court tried to settle the constitutional question in 1857, its decision would not restore trust. It would deepen the divide even further. By 1857, the slavery crisis had already fractured political parties, produced violence in Kansas, and divided Congress. Many Americans now looked to the Supreme Court, hoping that constitutional law might settle what politicians had repeatedly failed to resolve. The case centered on Dred Scott, an enslaved man who had lived with his owner in territories where slavery had been prohibited. Scott argued that residence on free soil had made him legally free, and his case eventually reached the United States Supreme Court. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney and the court's majority delivered a sweeping decision. They ruled that Scott could not claim United States citizenship under the Constitution and that Congress lacked constitutional authority to prohibit slavery in federal territories. The ruling went far beyond one man's legal status. If Congress could not restrict slavery in the territories, then decades of political compromise suddenly looked constitutionally vulnerable. The entire idea that lawmakers could contain slavery through geographic limits had been thrown into doubt. Southern slaveholders generally welcomed the decision because it strengthened their argument that enslaved property could receive federal protection in the territories. Many Republicans in the North saw something very different. To them, the decision looked like proof that national institutions were being captured by what they called the slave power. And here is the critical thing. The Supreme Court had tried to settle the constitutional dispute by issuing a broad ruling. Instead, it convinced millions of Americans that even the highest court in the country could no longer act as a neutral referee. Think about the pattern. In 1820, Congress drew a line to restrict slavery's expansion. In 1854, Congress erased that line. Then, in 1857, the Supreme Court declared that Congress had lacked the authority to impose such a restriction in the first place. Every institution that had once promised a peaceful solution now seemed to deepen the conflict. The political center was shrinking, trust was collapsing, and each side increasingly believed the other was trying to control the future of the entire country. 2 years later, that fear would move from courtrooms and congressional chambers to a federal arsenal in Virginia. A small armed raid, led by John Brown, would fail quickly, but its psychological impact would push North and South even farther apart. In October 1859, the sectional crisis took another dangerous turn. Abolitionist John Brown led a small armed group into Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and seized the federal arsenal there. His goal was to obtain weapons and help trigger a broader uprising among enslaved people. The plan collapsed almost immediately. Local militia surrounded Brown's men, and United States Marines under Colonel Robert E. Lee stormed the engine house where Brown had taken refuge. Several raiders were killed, Brown was captured, and the hoped-for mass uprising never materialized. Brown was tried by the state of Virginia for treason, murder, and inciting a slave insurrection. He was convicted and executed in December 1859. Militarily, the raid had been a failure. Politically and psychologically, however, its impact was far greater than the size of the attack suggested. Across the South, many white slaveholders saw Harper's Ferry as proof that anti-slavery agitation could become armed rebellion. Rumors of future uprisings spread, militia activity increased, and suspicion toward Northern abolitionists intensified. Fear was now becoming another force pushing the sections apart. Northern reactions were more complicated. Many condemned Brown's violence, while some abolitionists praised his willingness to die fighting slavery. That difference in reaction alarmed Southern observers, who increasingly believed that the North might eventually tolerate, encourage, or even support attacks on the slave system. John Brown did not cause the Civil War. But Harper's Ferry acted as a psychological accelerant, turning political distrust into something more immediate and frightening. 1 year later, Americans would enter a presidential election in which that fear, combined with decades of sectional conflict, would finally split the national political system apart. By 1860, the United States was entering a presidential election unlike any it had seen before. The old political coalitions had fractured, sectional distrust had deepened, and the Democratic Party itself split into competing Northern and Southern factions. 4 major candidates entered the race. Abraham Lincoln represented the Republicans, Stephen Douglas led the Northern Democrats, John C. Breckinridge represented the Southern Democrats. John Bell ran for the Constitutional Union Party, which tried to avoid the slavery issue and preserve the Union. Lincoln's Republican platform did not call for the immediate abolition of slavery where it already existed. Its central position was that slavery should not expand into the Western territories. That distinction mattered, but it did little to reassure many white Southerners. To slaveholders and secessionists, stopping expansion threatened more than access to new land. If future states entered the Union as free states, Southern influence in Congress could gradually decline. The institution of slavery could become increasingly surrounded by a growing free state majority. The election map exposed how far the country had already divided. Lincoln won without carrying most of the South and without receiving a majority of the national popular vote. His strength came overwhelmingly from northern and western free states. And here is the critical thing. Lincoln's victory did not create sectional polarization. It revealed how complete that polarization had already become. A candidate could now win the presidency while receiving almost no electoral support across much of the slaveholding South. For many secessionists, the result confirmed their fear that the political balance of the Union had permanently shifted. South Carolina moved first, voting to secede in December 1860. Other Deep South states followed before Lincoln even took the presidential oath. But we do not have to guess what these states believed they were defending. Several of them published formal declarations explaining their reasons for leaving the Union, and those documents make the central issue of the secession crisis remarkably difficult to hide. When historians ask why the Deep South chose secession, there is no need to rely only on later interpretations. Several seceding states published formal declarations explaining their reasoning. Those documents give us something unusually valuable: the political arguments of the secessionists in their own time. South Carolina focused heavily on the constitutional conflict over fugitive slaves and accused northern states of refusing to enforce obligations protecting slaveholders. Its leaders argued that the federal compact had been violated because northern resistance increasingly prevented slave owners from recovering people who had escaped bondage. Mississippi was even more explicit. Its declaration tied the state's economic and social position directly to slavery. Georgia likewise described anti-slavery politics as a growing threat to Southern property and political security, while Texas defended a racial and labor system built around the enslavement of African Americans. This matters because one of the most common modern arguments claims that secession was fundamentally about states' rights rather than slavery. States' rights certainly appeared in Southern constitutional arguments, but that raises a more important question. States' rights to protect what? Again and again, the documents return to slavery. They discuss the protection of slave property, the return of fugitives, the expansion of slavery, resistance to anti-slavery politics, and the fear that a Republican administration would eventually weaken the institution. Slavery was also far more than a cultural disagreement. By 1860, nearly 4 million enslaved people lived in the United States. Their forced labor supported a vast agricultural economy, especially cotton production, while their legal status represented enormous wealth for slaveholding families and investors. That made slavery simultaneously a labor system, a property system, a racial hierarchy, and a source of political power. Restricting its expansion was therefore interpreted by many Southern leaders not as one isolated policy dispute, but as a threat to the future of their entire social order. This distinction is essential. Not every Southern soldier later fought for exactly the same personal reason, just as not every Northerner entered the war as an abolitionist. Individual motivations were complicated, but the political leaders who drove secession left behind documents explaining the crisis they believed justified leaving the Union. And those documents make the central issue extraordinarily difficult to avoid. You do not have to guess what secessionists feared. They wrote it down. Yet even after the first states began leaving the Union, war was not inevitable. Washington made one final attempt to revive the old machinery of compromise. By the winter of 1860, the Union was coming apart. South Carolina had already seceded. Other Deep South states were moving in the same direction, and members of Congress were searching desperately for some formula that might stop the crisis before political separation turned into war. One of the most important proposals came from Senator John J. Crittenden of Kentucky. His plan offered a series of constitutional amendments designed to protect slavery where it already existed and restore a geographic boundary similar to the old Missouri Compromise line. The idea was familiar. Extend the 36-degree 30-minute line westward, protect slavery south of it, prohibit slavery north of it, and try once again to divide the sectional conflict with geography. In another generation, such a bargain might have survived. But America in 1860 was not America in 1820. Republicans refused to accept the expansion of slavery into territories where it had previously been excluded. Many secessionists, meanwhile, no longer trusted that any compromise inside the Union could permanently protect the slave system. And here is the deeper problem. Compromise only works when both sides still believe they will share a political future. By the end of 1860, that belief was disappearing. Every earlier bargain had postponed the same conflict, and every later crisis had made trust harder to rebuild. The Crittenden proposals failed. By the time Abraham Lincoln took office in March 1861, 7 states had already declared secession and formed the Confederate States of America. The constitutional argument was now becoming a question of territory, authority, and military control. And in Charleston Harbor, one unresolved symbol of federal authority remained. Fort Sumter still flew the United States flag. It was short on supplies, surrounded by Confederate forces, and rapidly becoming the place where decades of political failure would finally turn into gunfire. By April 1861, the political crisis had become a military standoff. Fort Sumter remained under United States control in the middle of Charleston Harbor, even though South Carolina had already seceded and joined the newly formed Confederacy. The fort was running short on supplies. President Abraham Lincoln faced a dangerous choice. Abandoning Sumter could make the federal government appear to accept secession. Reinforcing it with troops, however, risked provoking an immediate military confrontation. Lincoln chose a narrower course. He informed South Carolina that the government intended to send provisions to the fort rather than launch a military attack. But Confederate leaders still faced their own decision. Would they allow a United States installation to remain inside the harbor of a state they now claimed had left the Union? On April 11, Confederate authorities demanded that Major Robert Anderson surrender Fort Sumter. Anderson refused. Before dawn the next morning, Confederate batteries opened fire. The bombardment continued for more than a day, until Anderson agreed to evacuate the fort. This was the moment the constitutional crisis became open warfare. Fort Sumter was the first major military confrontation of the Civil War, and its political impact was immediate. Lincoln called for troops, and several additional slave states soon joined the Confederacy. But now the cannons looked different. They did not create the Missouri Crisis, the Mexican territorial dispute, the Fugitive Slave Act, Bleeding Kansas, Dred Scott, John Brown, the election of 1,860, or secession. Fort Sumter explains when Americans began fighting a full national war. It does not, by itself, explain why Americans had reached the point where firing on one another seemed preferable to another political compromise. The fort was the detonation point. The explosive had been assembled piece by piece for decades, and that brings us to the harder question. What, in the end, actually caused the American Civil War? So what actually caused the American Civil War? The simplest answer is Fort Sumter. That is where the shooting war began, but Fort Sumter was the trigger, not the complete origin. By April 1861, the deeper conflict had already been built into American politics for decades. At the center was slavery, especially the question of whether slavery would expand into the Western territories. That issue shaped arguments over federal power, states' rights, representation in Congress, economic interests, and the future balance between free and slave states. Around that central conflict were other forces. Failed compromises repeatedly postponed the crisis without resolving it. Political parties broke apart. The Supreme Court deepened distrust. Violence in Kansas and at Harper's Ferry made sectional fears more immediate. The election of 1,860 then exposed how completely the national political system had divided. It is also important to separate the cause of secession from the personal motives of every individual who later fought. Not every Confederate soldier entered the war for the same reason. Not every Union soldier initially fought to abolish slavery. At first, preserving the Union was the federal government's primary war aim, but that does not erase the central role of slavery in the political crisis that produced secession. The declarations written by seceding states repeatedly discussed slave property, fugitive slaves, anti-slavery politics, and fears about the future of the institution. That distinction matters because history becomes misleading when every cause is treated as equally important. States' rights mattered, constitutional interpretation mattered, economic power mattered, sectional identity mattered. But again and again, those disputes became explosive because they revolved around slavery and its future. There is a broader lesson here. Political compromise can buy time, but time is not the same thing as a solution. Institutions work only when people still believe those institutions can produce legitimate outcomes. Once that trust collapses, even ordinary elections and court decisions can become sources of greater instability. There is another lesson, too. Expansion can magnify contradictions that a society has avoided confronting. Every new Western territory forced the United States to reopen the same unresolved question until the old political machinery could no longer contain it. And perhaps the most useful lesson is methodological. When people argue about why a political movement acted, start with what its leaders wrote at the time. Later, myths can become powerful, but primary documents often reveal priorities with far less ambiguity. The American Civil War began with cannon fire at Fort Sumter. But the road to those cannons had been under construction for generations. The first shot was fired in 1861. The conflict behind it was much older.